Throughout the history of the Orthodox Church, several men have risen to great prominence and influence within the upper ranks of ecclesiastical hierarchy and intellectual circles, only to later be condemned and deposed after their doctrines were scrutinized more closely. Few, however, merit as much infamy as Nestorius, Archbishop of Constantinople, whose anathematization still echoes on every first Sunday of Great Lent. Nestorius is commonly known for his bitter rivalry with Saint Cyril of Alexandria over his doctrine regarding the nature and person of Jesus Christ, nowadays known as Nestorianism. He argued that because Mary was not the origin of Jesus Christ's divinity, but rather his humanity, that she should be called Christotokos instead of Theotokos. His ultimate downfall at the Council of Ephesus is remembered as one of the major triumphs of the Church over heresy and a defining moment in the development in the field of Christology. However, the Nestorian crisis is not limited merely to the final decision of the Third Ecumenical Council. A further look reveals a wide web of interpersonal conflicts, political scheming, doctrinal nuances, and forgotten facts which paint a much more detailed and clear picture of the controversy and ultimately of the man, Nestorius himself. Nestorius was born around the year 386 AD in Germaniscia, Roman Syria, in the immediate aftermath of the Meletian Schism. Although we do not know much of Nestorius' early life, we do know he received his theological education in the Catechetical School of Antioch, where he was also ordained to the priesthood and to the monastic orders. While at Antioch, Nestorius started gaining notoriety for his eloquence in his sermons, a skill which earned him to be considered to the dignity of the episcopacy in none other than the See of Constantinople, at the age of 42. Nestorius was not the first Antiochian clergyman to have been suddenly thrust into the life of the imperial capital. St. John Chrysostom, a few decades before him, was also consecrated as archbishop after reports of his impressive speaking abilities. On top of his oratorical skills, he was also commended for his asceticism. All in all, Nestorius' character was above reproach, and this earned him a great degree of estimation. His elevation was well received by other patriarchs of the Church, such as Pope St. Celestine and even St. Cyril himself, who wrote to Emperor Theodosius II, quote, "He was chosen as one practiced in the doctrines of the Gospels and the Apostles, trained in godliness, and holding the right faith, altogether blamelessly. Your pious Majesty longed to have such a man, and all who are set over the holy churches, and I myself also. And indeed, when the letters of the most pious bishops about his consecration were sent round by those who advanced him thereto, I wrote back without delay, rejoicing, praising, praying, that by the decree from above, all choicest good should come to our brother and fellow minister." For all effects and purposes, Nestorius was a bulwark of orthodoxy and piety to all the clergy, lay people, and civil servants who celebrated his ascension. It is also important to note that Nestorius rose to the throne during a complicated time for Constantinople. The city had experienced deep social, political, and ecclesiastical rifts in the aftermath of the deposition of St. John Chrysostom, which greatly upset the general populace, who went on to openly defy the hierarchy that had repudiated him. Moreover, several ambitious clergymen in the city fiercely competed for the episcopal throne during the 3 vacancies that took place up until Nestorius' term. This led the emperor to discard any candidates in Constantinople itself and to look outward to Antioch, ultimately deciding on the election of Nestorius. It was in this incredibly tense climate that Nestorius arrived at the imperial city in April of 428 AD. It would not be too outlandish to believe that many people may have set their hopes on Nestorius, after so many years of turmoil, to finally pacify the Church of Constantinople. After all, it would have seemed as if they finally had a true successor to St. John in their hands. However, he is purported to have said the following in front of a whole crowd in an address to the emperor in his consecration ceremony: "Give me, my prince, the earth purged of heretics, and I will give you heaven as a recompense. Assist me in destroying heretics, and I will assist you in vanquishing the Persians." Although reportedly several people were sympathetic to Nestorius' zealotry, many others viewed this boisterous proclamation with great suspicion and wariness, and rightfully so. This proclamation would prove to be the foreboding omen of what Nestorius' episcopacy would turn out to be. Socrates of Constantinople further relates that as soon as 5 days had elapsed from Nestorius' ordination, he had already begun ordering to lay waste to all the Arian, Quartodeciman, Macedonianist, and Novatian congregations, not just within the city, but throughout his entire jurisdiction, which allegedly earned him the title of incendiary from Orthodox and schismatic alike. Soon enough, however, Nestorius' wrath would be directed not just toward heretics, but to his own flock as well. When he came from Antioch, Nestorius brought with himself a priest by the name of Anastasius, who would be his closest confidant for the remainder of his ecclesiastical career. Ironically, however, Anastasius would go on to set off the controversy that would hurl Nestorius into infamy when in November of the same year he purportedly proclaimed in a sermon, "Let no one call Mary Theotokos, for Mary was but a woman, and it is impossible that God should be born of a woman." Upon hearing this, the faithful of Constantinople were utterly scandalized. Surely, many would have thought a fanatic of Nestorius' caliber would instantly put down this type of preaching. Yet it would turn out that, instead, Nestorius would come out in ardent defense of his friend Anastasius and his doctrine in his Christmas sermon, where he is famously said to have proclaimed that Mary, quote, "bore not God, for that which is born of a flesh is flesh." To be ordered to cease calling Mary Theotokos was the height of insolence to all the Orthodox in Constantinople. As we have seen, however, Nestorius was in fact not the first one to publicly profess or develop the Nestorian doctrine, as the name would have us believe, but rather his friend Anastasius. Still though, Anastasius is far from being the true author of Nestorianism. Edward Pusey, a major proponent of the Oxford movement, who wrote extensively on the Nestorian controversy, describes Nestorianism as a, quote, hereditary disease within the whole province of Antioch, lingering in the minds of many renowned clerics of the church, but particularly he mentions Diodor of Tarsus and Theodore of Mopsuestia as its most vocal proponents. St. Cyril, likewise, makes the same connection and places special emphasis on Diodor, whom he accuses of having, quote, darkened the mind of Nestorius. Pusey, on the other hand, places more weight on Theodore, as he believes the doctrine is more present in his writing. As Nestorius most likely never met Diodor, it is much more plausible that he engaged with its ideas through his literary works under the tutelage of Theodore of Mopsuestia during his time at Antioch when he was a monk. A serious ecclesiastical crisis was now beginning to brew under his very feet. He was vehemently hated by his own laity, and several in the clergy openly denounced him, some going as far as to even severing communion with the patriarchal see. The incessant cries of the church, however, could not impede Nestorius' leverage of his newfound power and authority as bishop of the imperial city. Now even the Orthodox would suffer the same lot as the heretics persecuted by Nestorius, and endure all sorts of terrible abuses at his disposition. The Archimandrite Basil reported in a petition to the Emperor Theodosius, quote, "When he had heard from us that what he had said, that Mary only bore man consubstantial with herself, and what is born of a flesh, is not Orthodox language, immediately he had us seized and thence beaten by a crowd of the officers. We were led to the prison, and there they stripped us naked as prisoners and subject to punishment, bound us to pillars, threw us down and kicked us. What in the civil courts we do not say that clerks, archimandrites, or monks, nay, or any secular persons do not suffer, we endured in the church lawlessly from the lawless ones." Basil further relates, "A monk of the simpler sort was constrained by zeal in the midst of the church to hinder this herald of impiety from entering at the celebration, being a heretic. Him having beaten, he delivered to the magnificent governors, and being again beaten and paraded publicly, the crier proclaiming his offense, he, Nestorius, sent him into exile." Nestorius was, needless to say, quite ruthless and heavy-handed with those who refused to hold communion with this idea of the Christotokos. By spring of 429, news of the events transpiring at Constantinople had already reached both St. Celestine and St. Cyril in Rome and Alexandria respectively. Combined with the many years prior which he had served with his uncle Theophilus, who was patriarch before him, it is safe to say that St. Cyril had likely accrued a considerable degree of political acumen in that time. In any case, the controversy had reached St. Cyril by way of the monks of his diocese, who had been exposed to Nestorius' sermon where he had denied the title of Theotokos. In light of this, St. Cyril wrote an epistle to the monks in his jurisdiction justifying the title. The way St. Cyril wrote the epistle gives the impression that he believed that this scandal among the monastics was a symptom of an Arian resurgence. Most likely, though, this was his way of giving Nestorius the benefit of the doubt. This is evidenced in St. Cyril's first letter, which he wrote upon discovering Nestorius was not pleased after the contents of the letter to the monks was made available to him. In this first epistle, St. Cyril addresses the circulation of these homilies and the scandal that they have caused throughout the East, and asks him to confirm whether or not the homilies in question are of his authorship. Quote, "Since the most pious and most God-loving Bishop of Rome, Celestine, and the most God-loving bishops with him denounced them, I must take counsel with your reverence concerning the documents which were brought here, I do not know how, as to whether at any time they are your reverence's or not. How shall we take care of those who come from all the churches of the East and murmur against the documents?" Despite Nestorius' alleged discontent according to St. Cyril, he sent a very brief and rather cordial reply to his letter with, quote, "largeness of heart and love and salutation." He does, however, mildly chastise St. Cyril for having supposedly acted not, quote, "in keeping with fraternal love." Nestorius does not address the contents of St. Cyril's first epistle and the allegations set forth, leaving his reply at merely the length of a paragraph. His discontent was, however, evident in his sermons where he alludes to Cyril as the, quote, "Egyptian." St. Cyril later wrote a second letter to Nestorius, citing the Fathers and the Scriptures in defense of the Orthodox interpretation of the Incarnation. Two natures, human and divine, inseparably united into one person, one Son, whose human nature specifically suffered on the cross. He creates a sharp contrast with Nestorius' doctrine, or rather the logical conclusion thereof, which he asserts creates two sons by distinguishing the natures as two separate persons. Frustration begins to show as Nestorius' reply takes on a more condescending tone than in his first letter. Strangely enough, he levels the accusation against St. Cyril of having said that the divinity suffered alongside the humanity, despite the fact that he said the exact opposite in the epistle he is replying to, something which may have actually even annoyed St. Cyril, as seen in his letter to the clergy of Constantinople. Regardless, this is what allows Nestorius to disclose more elaborately and openly the reasoning behind the title of Christotokos, which he devised for the Mother of God, stating that, quote, "God the Word was in no need of a second begetting," and that, quote, "God the Word was not the son of David." He further says in his own words that, quote, "Everywhere in sacred scripture, whenever it makes mention of the economy of the Lord, the birth for our sake and the passion are ascribed, not to the divinity, but to the humanity of Christ. So, according to the most precise appellation, the Holy Virgin is to be called the Mother of Christ, not the Mother of God." Upon reading the letters and extracts produced by Nestorius, the crux of the issue appears to be primarily that Nestorius believed that by giving Mary the title of Theotokos, this necessitated that Mary have also begotten the divinity of Christ. And not only did he seemingly hold this as the logical conclusion of the title, but it seems that he sincerely believed that this indicated that all of the people who used it did indeed believe that Mary was the origin of the divinity. After the second epistle to Nestorius, St. Cyril wrote to St. Celestine in Rome, informing him of the details of the controversy and asking for his counsel on how to proceed, whether to sever or maintain communion with Nestorius. St. Cyril especially mentions the situation that occurred with a certain excommunicated bishop by the name of Dorotheus, who, having caused a massive scandal by anathematizing the use of Theotokos in what was presumably a sermon in a public liturgy presided by Nestorius, was received back into communion by him. Nestorius had already written to Pope Celestine previously on the topic of two exiled Pelagian clerics from the West, but he dedicates most of the letter to detail how he has dealt with the, quote, "serious corruption of orthodoxy that has taken place within his diocese, both with, quote, sternness and gentleness, and complains over the use of Theotokos." Already by the time St. Cyril had sent his letter, St. Celestine had decided that he would take no part in Nestorius' affair and praises the refutation sent out by St. Cyril against Nestorius. What's more, he then calls for, quote, "open judgment against him if he continues, for such a wound must be cut out," and incentivizes him to cease communion with Nestorius if he did not repent, something St. Cyril explicitly said he was at pains to avoid in his previous letter to Pope Celestine. After this epistle, Nestorius was condemned by a local council in Rome, in a twist of irony employing the same firmness Nestorius had evoked in his epistle to the Pope. By the latter half of 430 AD, Nestorius now had two major patriarchates and an overwhelming amount of clergy and laypeople in his own diocese in direct opposition to himself. Only a little over a year into his tenure, his situation was nothing less than precarious. However, Nestorius was not totally surrounded. He still had a trump card in his deck in the form of his personal connections. He had curried the favor of none other than Emperor Theodosius himself, arguably the main factor that has kept him afloat up to this point. Occupying the seat of the Patriarchate of Antioch was also his theologically like-minded and longtime personal friend John, although he had also retained a cordial relationship with Saint Cyril. In fact, during the time Cyril and John corresponded through writing, John attempted to persuade Nestorius to accept Theotokos, saying, quote, "This name no one of the ecclesiastical teachers has declined, for those who have used it have been many and eminent, and those who have not used it have never imputed any error to those who used it." In another correspondence with Nestorius, he says, quote, "For to use a convenient word in the dispensation of our sovereign ruler Christ for us, which has been used by many of the fathers, and is true as to the saving birth of the Virgin, is easy, which thy holiness ought not to decline, nor take that into account, that one ought not to do things contrary. For if thy mind is the same as that of the fathers and teachers of the church, what grief has it to utter a pious thought in a corresponding word?" We see then that even Nestorius' ideological allies were painfully aware that Christotokos constituted an accretion in the face of the patristic legacy up to that point. That is not to say that people like John of Antioch or other allies of Nestorius were not thoroughly Nestorian in thought, but it demonstrates that the thought of publicly denying the traditional use of Theotokos had never even crossed the mind of even the most renowned Antiochian theologians. Socrates of Constantinople, in his History of the Controversy, maintains that this, quote, causeless alarm toward Theotokos betrayed his ignorance of the treatises of the fathers, and that his eloquence conveniently obfuscated his lack of knowledge. He then went on to list several fathers who had used the title to substantiate his claim. Interestingly, however, the historian and priest, Father John McGuckin, who makes note of Socrates' assertion, theorizes that Nestorius' resistance to the title of Theotokos is not necessarily a result of, quote, theological incompetence, but rather that, quote, it demonstrates his thesis that the Christological use of the word had never been elaborated properly. Indeed, the list of the fathers who used the title did little more in Nestorius' estimation than confirm his suspicion that here was a peculiarly Egyptian theologumenon, which he did not wish to see imposed on the Church universally. McGuckin's theory does align with Nestorius' own words from one of his sermons, where he alleges that, quote, the teachers had not opportunity to set before them aught of the more accurate teaching. Nestorius ostensibly believed that all of the ancient fathers had simply accepted this piece of theological speculative tradition without a second thought. His particular animosity towards the popularity of this, quote, Egyptian theologumenon may have also potentially stemmed not just from the rivalry between Constantinople and Alexandria since the days of John Chrysostom, but also the rivalry between Alexandria and Antioch as rival schools of theology. By this point, St. Cyril had also acquired the support of St. Juvenal, Bishop of Jerusalem. In his letter to him, St. Cyril expresses his dismay in retrospect. Where he had initially believed that Nestorius would be a, quote, true shepherd, he later found a persecutor of the true faith. He exhorts St. Juvenal to join his efforts to establish orthodoxy, but also to persuade Nestorius. He closes the letter suggesting to also convince the emperor to depose Nestorius should he not recant. The time had now come. St. Cyril had, to varying degrees, secured the backing of key clergymen throughout the whole of the Church. Nestorius had failed to disavow his previous theological statements. Thus, St. Cyril intended to now put into force St. Celestine's warrant of excommunication. In late November of 430 AD, St. Cyril gathered with his bishops in council and issued a synodical letter addressed to Nestorius, almost being the late classical equivalent of a cease and desist letter. Even up until this point in the controversy, St. Cyril still goes through the trouble of referring to him as, quote, the most pious and God-loving fellow bishop Nestorius in the introduction. However, St. Cyril at this point has dropped any pretension of conciliarity and long-suffering. Nestorius must now heed the counsel of his fellow patriarchs and publicly renounce his teachings, or else. He says, quote, If your reverence does not do this, according to the time defined and limited in the letter of the aforementioned most holy and God-revering and fellow minister of ours, Celestine, know that you have no clerical office among us, nor place, nor esteem among the priests of God and the bishops. The rest of the letter contains a rather elaborate summary of the Orthodox interpretation of the Incarnation, stressing the belief in one undivided Son of God. At the end, St. Cyril attaches 12 anathematizations. Nestorius has 10 days to affirm them to guarantee his adherence to the Orthodox faith, or face excommunication. The synodical letter from Alexandria finally reached Nestorius the first week of December. The resolution of the conflict was seemingly almost at hand. Yet now another hurdle arose in the prosecution of Nestorius. Earlier in November, Emperor Theotokos had convoked a council to be convened at the city of Ephesus at Pentecost next year. Not only was this presumably a final political maneuver ordered by Nestorius to vindicate himself, as alleged by St. Celestine, the charges against him by the synodical letter and the papal suggestion to Alexandria had now become null and void in the face of the imperial summons. In response to St. Cyril's 12 anathemas, Nestorius, in one of his sermons, issued in return 12 of his own anathemas. Afterwards, he sent a copy of Cyril's anathematisms to John of Antioch to fully win him over. Upon receiving a copy of the anathematisms, John purportedly had a difficult time believing that they were authored by St. Cyril, having considered them to be Apollinarian. Thus, he tasked Andrew of Samosata and Theodore of Cyrus with writing their own refutations against the 12 chapters. These two men were some of Nestorius' most fervent friends and supporters, and Theodore himself would not actually fully renounce his allegiance to Nestorius up to the Council of Chalcedon. By early June, clergy from all parts and from all persuasions of doctrine had begun to assemble at Ephesus. Nestorius had arrived with a delegation of 10 to 15 bishops, and with an imperial regiment almost immediately after Easter, as the council was, after all, almost definitely his own machination. St. Cyril and St. Juvenal, on the other hand, arrived around Pentecost, with St. Cyril being accompanied by a delegation of 50 Alexandrian bishops. Even before their arrival, the environment was thick with tension. Memnon, the Metropolitan of Ephesus, had closed off all of the churches of the city to the Nestorians. Many bishops who traveled long distances to arrive at the council died there from either sickness or old age. John of Antioch and his party, whom Nestorius counted on as a critical base of support, were several days off from Ephesus. John wrote to Cyril that, should he take longer than the stipulated 4 days, the council should proceed. St. Cyril seemingly took this as a license to start the council post-haste, in spite of the complaints of Nestorius and his peers and the request to wait for John. Their pleading fell on silent ears, however, as on June 22nd, St. Cyril enthroned the Gospel book in the Church of Mary and opened the council. Outraged, Nestorius and his party departed from the assembly and decided to hold their own rival council. Nestorius refused and ignored the summons of the council, having allegedly proclaimed, quote, "I cannot term him God who was 2 and 3 months old. I am therefore clear of your blood, and shall in future come no more among you." In the initial phase of the council, the correspondence that had taken place between St. Cyril and Nestorius over the past 2 years was read aloud, discussed, and scrutinized in light of select compiled patristic quotations. St. Cyril's refutations were acclaimed as orthodox, and the bishops present jointly signed the deposition of Nestorius, even some who had complained that St. Cyril did not await John's arrival. John, however, did eventually arrive and was, to say the least, displeased that the council had not only proceeded without him, but had gone as far as to even depose Nestorius without his knowledge. He then proceeded to join the assembly of the Nestorian party to depose Cyril and Memnon in turn, and sent a report to the emperor of the events transpiring at Ephesus, presenting their parallel synod as the official synod operating in Ephesus. The reply from the emperor condemned the deposition of Nestorius and St. Cyril's premature action, and decreed that all of the bishops present in Ephesus were strictly prohibited from leaving the city and must wait for the arrival of the imperial commissioner before further action. While the commissioner was on his way, now that they had received the papal legates who had been ordered by St. Celestine to support St. Cyril and confirm their assent to the deposition of Nestorius. For several weeks, the Cyrillian party had been attempting to reach out and contact the emperor, but they were continually hindered by Nestorius' allies in the capital, particularly a civil servant close to him, Count Candidian. Apparently, it took for a beggar carrying a letter from the Cyrilians in a stick to finally get the message through to Emperor Theodosius. It seems to be after this point that imperial favor started tilting in favor of Cyril instead of Nestorius. By August, the imperial commissioner Count John arrived in Ephesus and announced that Cyril, Memnon, and even Nestorius himself were deposed. Nestorius, on one hand, believed that this was done by the emperor in order to make both parties reconcile and end the affair. The Cyrillian party, on the other hand, believed in a somewhat similar vein that this was a ploy organized not by the emperor, but rather the Antiochian bishops in order to exhaust them and make them relent. Quote, "We are being killed with the heat through the heaviness of the air, and someone is buried almost daily. Whence we pray your reverences to go to the gracious sovereign and say that the synod is oppressed by those who prevent any term being given, so that we are altogether perishing by exhaustion." Count John and Emperor Theodosius attempted to mediate between the two parties, to no avail. The Nestorians celebrated the imprisonment of Cyril and Memnon, and had seemingly become confident in their ultimate triumph, and the Cyrillians refused the reconciliation formula composed by the Nestorians. The final attempt at mediation was at a meeting with 8 delegates from both parties respectively at Chalcedon. The meeting was, however, totally fruitless, and Theodosius saw himself obliged to force an end to the controversy. Ultimately, he decides to dissolve the council and confirms the deposition of Nestorius, and sends all of the clergy congregated at Ephesus home, and thus restored St. Cyril and Memnon to their office. In Nestorius' place, St. Maximin was elevated to the patriarchate. The controversy still continued, though to a lesser degree, now with Nestorius out of the picture, until it eventually morphed into the controversy which later surrounded Dioscorus of Alexandria, St. Cyril's successor. St. Celestine had petitioned Theodosius to ban Nestorius from public discourse upon his return to Antioch. However, it seemed that this command was totally ignored, as John of Antioch notified the emperor that Nestorius still publicly held to his doctrines. To this end, and to his further humiliation, Nestorius was permanently banished to the Oasis in Egypt, ecclesiastical territory that was firmly under St. Cyril's jurisdiction. Nestorius lived the remaining 20 years of his life in obscurity, quote, "at home, mostly given to his books, and living quietly by himself," according to Theodore of Cyrus. Almost all of his writings were destroyed. Only one of them remains with us today, titled The Bazaar of Heraclides, where he defends his life's work and alleges the injustice of his deposition, even charging St. Cyril with bribing the emperor to favor him in the resolution of the council. Finally, a year after having written his book, Nestorius passed away in 451. The same year, the Council of Chalcedon was summoned. His shadow would haunt ecclesiastical affairs even up to the time of Justinian, and some would even allege that his doctrine still lives on in some corners of the Christian world even to this day. And that was the story of Nestorius, the man who never invented Nestorianism.